The Roman Republic for 500 years was defined by its rejection of absolute rule by one man and its preservation of public law. And on March 15th, 44 BC, Republican principles were tested when a coalition of senators assassinated the dictator for life, Julius Caesar. Those senators claimed that what they did was rooted in that foundational ethos, that they were preserving the republic, that Julius Caesar was a tyrant, if not a king. Over the past 2,000 years, scholars, historians, philosophers have all dissected the murder of Caesar. It presents massive moral questions, constitutional questions, and historic questions. And by request, I'm going to give you my take on this crucial historical question. Were the senators who assassinated Julius Caesar justified? We will answer that question on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Q&A Episode 3. Was the assassination of Julius Caesar justified? Before we get started today, folks, I just want to say thanks again for listening to the podcast. If you haven't picked up my book, Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World, it's available everywhere books are sold. I'm excited that the publisher will be issuing a paperback edition, so thanks for those of you who already bought the book. The next book is, in fact, already in the hopper. I'm not ready to announce details of that, but eventually I will. In the meantime, there's always this podcast every week, and there's also my YouTube channel you can check out. And if you like this podcast or the YouTube channel, please, at the very least, press like on the episodes that you enjoy. You can leave a comment and definitely subscribe to the podcast and also the YouTube channel. All right, that's enough self-promotion. Let's get to today's episode. Today marks the third episode in my questions and answer series, responding to questions I've received over the first year or so of doing this podcast. And boy, am I looking forward to this one. Was the Senate justified in assassinating Julius Caesar? I want to answer this question by looking both at the action itself, but also the precedents for it, which go back all the way to the beginning of the Republic. Because Julius Caesar's death marked the culmination of tensions that had simmered for centuries within the Roman Republic. In other words, it's about a lot more than just Julius Caesar, the man. To really understand what the conspirators were doing, we have to first travel back nearly 500 years before Julius Caesar's death to the founding of the Roman Republic around 509 BC. And by the way, if you want a lengthy treatment about Rome before it was a republic, the very deepest history of Rome, you can check out my YouTube channel because I did a 6-part video series on that exact topic. Anyway, according to legend, the expulsion of the very last Roman king, his name was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, set a precedent that would echo throughout the centuries. This foundational myth was steeped in violence, resistance to autocracy, and it shaped the Republic's ethos and provided a lens through which the senators viewed Caesar's rise. So what was that event? In the late 6th century BC, this king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, ruled Rome. He was cruel, he was vengeful, and he had a terrible family. One of his sons, Sextus Tarquinius, raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. And then Lucretia, partly due to her own shame, but also because of her strict adherence to the Roman moral code, committed suicide after the rape. Why did she do that? Well, it's complicated. Essentially, she did not want to provide a loophole for some future adulterous woman to escape the death penalty for adultery by claiming that she was the victim of a rape. So Lucretia did her duty by committing suicide, even though she was innocent, so that she could ensure that no loophole was opened up for some future adulteress. Lucretia's suicide was public. She had gathered together several of the nobility there in Rome, and she stabbed herself with a dagger. And one of the men that was there, Lucius Junius Brutus, ancestor of one of Caesar's assassins, drew out the dagger, still bloody from Lucretia's body, and at that moment he swore an oath. And we have this oath preserved in Livy's History of Rome. It goes like this, quote, "By this blood, most pure before the outrage wrought by the king's son, I swear, and you, O gods, I call to witness, that I will drive hence Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, and I will not suffer him nor anyone else to reign in Rome." So this was an act of defiance which led to the expulsion of the monarchy and birthed the Roman Republic, but it also, most importantly for Julius Caesar's assassination, enshrined the idea that tyrannicide was a moral and a political duty of Romans. So even though this story is quasi-mythological, I mean, it's probably true that this king existed, that Brutus existed. It may even be true that there was some kind of violent episode like this around the time that the Roman Republic started. But the reality of the myth was not as important as the principle that it established. Rome's leaders were obligated to resist any individual who sought absolute power. And for 5 centuries, that ethos guided the Republic, creating a cultural and constitutional intolerance for kingship or any form of autocratic or tyrannical government. Myths and stories like this one served the Roman Republic as constitutional norms. The Roman Republic did not have a written constitution. Instead, it relied on a complex web of traditions, laws, precedents, and stories. The only exception to autocratic power in the Roman system was the dictatorship, but this was a temporary, highly limited office designed for absolute emergencies. It was limited to a 6-month term or the duration of whatever crisis it was designed to solve, whatever was shortest. Rome had named quite a few dictators in its early centuries, but by the time of Julius Caesar, that office had only been used one time in the past 150 years. So the dictatorship was not a normal means of exercising power in the Roman Republic. Instead, it was the Senate, composed of Rome's elite, that served as the guardian of Rome's traditions, norms, and constitutional precedents. And if any one senator, or any other man for that matter, ever attempted to centralize power, the removal of that figure would be not just permissible, but necessary. So that's the precedent. It goes back from the very beginning. Now, the next question we have to answer is, was Julius Caesar a tyrant? It's great if the Roman Republic had a kind of constitutional tradition of murdering tyrants, but we still have to examine whether Julius Caesar was such a person. Well, Julius Caesar was extraordinarily ambitious. That's definitely true. And we know that in 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, which was illegal. He ignited a civil war against the Republican loyalists. He then crossed the Roman Empire, defeating his rivals like Pompey and Cato, seizing control of Rome, its treasury, leveraging his military success to secure the title of dictator, which was initially for a limited term, and there was an emergency going on, albeit it was an emergency that Julius Caesar himself instigated. But later, that dictatorship became a lifelong appointment. Caesar was made dictator for life in 44 BC, and that definitely broke precedent. As dictator, he manipulated elections, he appointed loyalists to key positions, he demanded personal loyalty oaths from senators, effectively dismantling the Republic's system of checks and balances, such as they were. And Caesar's public persona reinforced the idea that he was above the law and certainly above the Senate. He sat on a golden throne in the Senate. He wore a laurel crown, a symbol associated with kings and gods. He placed his statues alongside those of divine figures and Rome's ancient kings. His body was declared sacrosanct, granting him unprecedented authority over political proceedings like elections and Senate meetings. And Caesar was a demagogue. His policies while dictator included things like debt forgiveness, land redistribution, and rent controls, the kinds of measures that alienated many members of the Senate, while also courting mass appeal among the population of Rome. He enacted these measures largely through his own authority and bypassed the Roman Senate, further centralizing power in the hands of one man. To many in the Senate, Caesar's actions and persona and the symbolism around him mirrored the tyranny of that last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus, and so demanded a response. And I have to say, I can see the argument here. The question is, was there some check on Caesar's power? Was there some other recourse members of the Senate could have pursued to go against Caesar's policies or kick him out of office? The fact is that Caesar's power, not just his office, but his personal power, was absolute. He controlled the military. He controlled the treasury. He controlled the democratic elections in the city. It wasn't possible to impeach him. It wasn't possible to vote him out of office. His dictatorship didn't even have a term limit, so even time no longer limited Julius Caesar. So members of the Senate really only had a single choice. They could acquiesce to Julius Caesar's tyranny, or they could act decisively. And so on the Ides of March, a group of senators struck Caesar down in the Senate, believing that his death would dismantle his autocratic regime and revive the republic's institutions. And if they didn't want to live under tyranny, that's what they had to do. Now, there are plenty of counterarguments. In fact, I'd say my position is probably a minority position among the historians and scholars that have tried to answer this question. Some of the counterarguments go like this. First of all, the conspirators obviously did not have good motives, and that is true. Brutus, Cassius, and others were clearly driven by envy, personal rivalry, and even desire for power themselves. They weren't really driven by altruism, at least that's the view that we get from the event as it's recorded in the sources. We definitely see this self-interest following Julius Caesar's assassination because the assassins of Julius Caesar had an opportunity to have Caesar declared as a tyrant, and they didn't. We talked about that, by the way, on episode 2 of this podcast, but a little bit of extra treatment here is probably justified. After Julius Caesar died, Mark Antony, who was the consul in Rome, and this is the highest office in the Roman Republic, Mark Antony called a meeting of all of the senators, and he explained to them that if Julius Caesar was declared a tyrant, which would then justify the assassins and what they did, then all of his acts would be annulled. And Julius Caesar had done a lot on his own authority, as I just mentioned. He appointed people to positions, he passed laws, he had given out land and other bequeathments, and plenty of senators had benefited from those bequeathments. Brutus himself, one of the guys that assassinated Julius Caesar, was currently serving as urban praetor because Julius Caesar had put him there. So if Julius Caesar was declared a tyrant by the Roman Senate, then all of his acts would be viewed as tyrannical and therefore null and void. All of those men would have lost their positions. If they truly cared about the Republic, they would be willing to bear the sacrifice of losing power. That's part of the package of Caesar being a tyrant. But they couldn't do it. Instead, they pushed for a compromise that was totally incoherent, which is Julius Caesar is not a tyrant, but also he wasn't murdered. Plainly, he was murdered, and as I've argued already in this episode, he was also a tyrant. And the fact that none of the assassins are recorded as having advocated for their own removal from office and the undoing of all of Caesar's policies says a lot about their lack of true Republican loyalty. And it's definitely true that all of that weakens the claim that the conspirators were liberators. But the question is not whether the conspirators were corrupt or flawed or hypocrites. The question is, was the act itself justified? Not what happened afterwards. The constitutional basis for removing a tyrant was valid, even if the way that the conspirators executed it was faulty. The constitutional framework of the Roman Republic allowed for tyrannicide regardless of the intentions, motivations, and personal character of those who carried it out. Another argument that's often put forward, and again, I think this is a reasonable one, is that the assassination of Julius Caesar did not restore the Republic. It triggered chaos. It led to civil wars and the rise of Octavian, who eventually became Rome's first emperor. We covered all of that on this podcast. Some would argue that this outcome proves that the conspirators were wrong to assassinate Julius Caesar. But again, I don't think the consequences of the action retroactively invalidate the action itself. It's 100% true that the assassination of one tyrant ended up leading to a different form of tyranny under the Principate and the Pax Romana. And it's pretty ironic that in claiming to act to save the Republic, the conspirators actually hastened its demise. It's one of the most poignant ironies in all of human history, but it still doesn't negate the historical and constitutional legitimacy of the assassination itself. Caesar was a tyrant, and the Senate had every right and indeed a duty to remove him, and violence was their last and only option. So, the Senate's assassination of Julius Caesar was justified, at least according to the Roman Republic's unwritten constitution, which permitted tyrannicide as a defense against autocracy. Caesar had accumulated power, he had acted symbolically as a king, he had subverted republican norms, and all of these things marked him as a tyrant in the mold of Tarquinius Superbus. Historical precedent supported this drastic measure of assassinating Julius Caesar. There were no legal means to oppose Caesar's perpetual dictatorship, and so assassination was the only recourse. The conspirators' motives may have been imperfect, and their post-assassination compromises definitely revealed self-interest, if not corruption. But these human failings don't erase the act's alignment with Rome's foundational principles. The conspirators drew on a 500-year legacy of resisting tyranny, acting as they believed their ancestors would have, and rightly so. The assassination of Julius Caesar tragically failed to save the Republic. In fact, like I said, it birthed the Roman Principate. And so that casts an unforgettable shadow over the conspirators' action. But the justification here does not lie in the success of the assassination, but in precedent and constitutionality. On March 15th, 44 BC, members of the Senate wielded their daggers not just against Caesar, but against tyranny. They may have struck for ignoble and naive reasons, but it was constitutionally sanctioned and morally justified stand against tyranny.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.